Benjamin Netanyahu grew up in a fiercely nationalistic Jewish home. His father, Benzion Netanyahu, was a historian of Spanish Jewry, an advisor to Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism, and the editor of the revisionists' daily newspaper Ha-Yarden. Jabotinsky was the spiritual father of the Israeli right. He and his party were the main ideological opposition to the mainstream socialist labor Zionism. The revisionists advocated a revision of the practical Zionism of David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, whereas practical Zionism called for Jewish settlement of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. The revisionists insisted on the Jewish right to sovereignty over the whole of mandatory Palestine and Transjordan. They were territorial maximalists who rejected the partition of Palestine and laid claim to both sides of the Jordan River, including the East Bank, which is present-day Jordan. The fact that no Jews lived on the East Bank of the Jordan made no difference to them. For Benzion Netanyahu, Jewish history was in large measure a history of holocausts. The core of his belief was that Jews have always been and will always be persecuted by all those around them. To his way of thinking, peace with Arabs was a dangerous illusion because Arabs could not be trusted. He was convinced that, whatever they may say, Arabs remained determined to destroy the Jewish state. From his father, Benjamin inherited the notion of us versus them, of a preordained and inescapable conflict between Arabs and Jews, and the fear that Jewish history would come to an end unless the Jews could defend themselves. In the Middle East, he said in 2018, there is a simple truth. There is no place for the weak. The foundational axiom of both father and son was that military power was the only solution to the Jewish predicament and the only instrument for attaining and preserving Jewish independence in the ancestral homeland. Jabotinsky also believed in the primacy of force. In 1923, he published an article under the title On the Iron Wall, We and the Arabs. If any one document deserves to be called the Bible of Zionist foreign policy, this is it. Its author argued that there is not even the slightest hope of ever obtaining a political agreement with the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, because Zionist and Arab aspirations were fundamentally opposed. Every indigenous people will resist alien settlers as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of the danger of foreign settlement. From this, he concluded that the Zionist goal of an independent Jewish state in Palestine could only be achieved unilaterally and by military force, behind an iron wall of Jewish military power. For Jabotinsky, however, the iron wall was not an end in itself, but a means to an end. It was intended to compel the Arabs to abandon any hope of defeating the Jews. Once this happened, Jabotinsky predicted, the Arab hardliners would be discredited and the moderates would come to the fore, open to compromise. Then, and only then, should the Zionists proceed to the second stage of the strategy, negotiations with the local Arabs about their status and rights in Palestine. In other words, Jewish military strength was to pave the way to an eventual political settlement with the Arab residents of Palestine. Jabotinsky did not spell out the endgame, but what he appeared to envisage was limited autonomy for the Arabs under Jewish rule rather than full sovereignty. Benjamin Netanyahu was elected leader of the Likud in March 1993. That year, he also published a book that set out his political creed, A Place Among the Nations, Israel and the World. The book was inspired by the teaching of Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Benzion Netanyahu. It presented the most embattled possible version of the history of Zionism and the State of Israel. Its central theme was the right of the Jewish people to the whole land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria, the biblical names for the West Bank. History was rewritten from a revisionist perspective in order to demonstrate that it was not the Jews who usurped the land from the Arabs, but the Arabs who usurped the land from the Jews. Britain was portrayed as no friend of the Jews, and the chapter on the British mandate in Palestine was simply called The Betrayal. The whole world was portrayed as hostile to the Jewish state, and anti-Semitism was said to lie at the root of this hostility. Netanyahu viewed Israel's relations with the Arab world as one of permanent conflict, as a never-ending struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. His image of the Arabs was consistently and comprehensively negative, and it did not admit the possibility of diversity or change. His book did not contain a single positive reference to the Arabs, their history, or their culture. Arab regimes were portrayed as ready practitioners of violence against the citizens of their own countries and across their borders. Violence is ubiquitous in the political life of all the Arab countries. It is the primary method of dealing with opponents, both foreign and domestic, both Arab and non-Arab. In addition, Netanyahu claimed that international terrorism is the quintessential Middle East export, and that its techniques everywhere are those of the Arab regimes and organizations that invented it. The Arab world was described as deeply hostile towards the West and to the Western notion of democracy. Netanyahu conceded that a few Arab rulers were friendly to the United States, but warned against the delusion that this reflected the real sentiments of the Arab masses. Such rulers, in his view, frequently represent only a thin crust lying over a volatile Arab and Islamic society. Israel's protracted war on Gaza has been attributed to Netanyahu's struggle for personal survival, or else his political reliance upon the far right. The deeper truth is that Netanyahu's resort to unilateral military might, his understanding of the Palestine conflict as zero-sum, his refusal to concede that the representatives of Gaza have any legitimate grievances, his resort to genocidal incitement, and his commitment to Jewish sovereignty from the river to the sea are all wholly consistent with his long-standing positions. Blaming the Gaza onslaught on Netanyahu's current legal predicaments obscures the relentless consistency of his political project over decades, while blaming Netanyahu's dependence on his far-right collaborators ignores the extent to which their respective projects are one and the same. Such explanations also obscure the extent to which the policies and premises of the far right, including Netanyahu, are shared across Israeli politics and throughout Israeli society. At the institutional level, it defies credibility to suppose that Netanyahu could prosecute a military offensive of such magnitude for purely personal considerations if he did not have considerable support within the military and intelligence establishments. Politically, the Gaza onslaught was not waged by Netanyahu alone, but by a national unity government that included Israel's most popular opposition leader, Benny Gantz. Gantz previously ran for office by declaring that only the strong survive, while claiming credit for having bombed parts of Gaza back to the Stone Age, positions Netanyahu could hardly disagree with. Israeli public opinion has overwhelmingly supported the Gaza campaign, or else believed the violence should be further escalated. More generally, Netanyahu did not become Israel's longest-serving prime minister by standing apart from Israeli Jewish society, but by embodying it. It follows that Netanyahu's vicious incitement and his criminal conduct in Gaza are not personal aberrations. They reflect the steady drift of Israeli society from a semblance of freedom and democracy to utter moral depravity. This process has been going on since the Israeli victory in the June 1967 war. The occupation of the Palestinian territories has eroded the foundations of Israeli democracy, violated core Jewish values, and turned Israel into a nation of oppressors and war criminals. The labor-led governments were responsible for initiating this process by the building of illegal settlements on Palestinian land, but under the Likud, it reached its most cruel, indeed genocidal climax. In truth, the origins of Israel's moral decadence go further back even than 1967. Israel has always been a settler colonial state. The logic of settler colonialism is the elimination of the native. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine is not a discrete event that ended with the 1948 war, but an ongoing process. What is new in the current war on Gaza is that Zionist settler colonialism has gone beyond ethnic cleansing to the brink of genocide,